Iowa, 1944. A young German soldier, his face still marked by the grime of battle and the shock of capture, steps onto American soil far different from the battlefields he knew. His name is Wilhelm Fischer, a prisoner of war trained to see Americans as ruthless enemies. He expects hardship, hostility, perhaps worse. Yet, within weeks, this same soldier would find himself seated not in a barren cell, but at the Sunday dinner table of an American farm family, the Millers, whose own sons were fighting men just like him overseas. How could such a thing happen? How could enemies, brought together by the chaos of global conflict, sit down to share bread under the same roof? This is the astonishing story of an unlikely bond forged against the backdrop of war, a testament to quiet acts of courage and compassion that unfolded far from the front lines, proving that sometimes humanity finds a way even in the darkest of times. Before Wilhelm Fischer ever saw the endless cornfields of Iowa, his world was confined by the suffocating ideology of Nazi Germany and the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. Born in the early 1920s in a small village in Bavaria, his youth was swept up in the fervent nationalism that consumed the nation. Like millions of others, he joined the Hitler Youth, his days filled with marches, drills, and lectures that hammered home the narrative of German superiority and the treachery of the outside world. America, in particular, was painted as a land of degenerate chaos, racially impure, controlled by Jewish financiers, and lacking the discipline and warrior spirit that defined the Reich. Newsreels showed him carefully selected images meant to inspire contempt. Decadent Hollywood stars, striking workers, breadlines from the Great Depression, all curated to prove that the United States was a hollow giant ready to crumble. His school teachers, his youth leaders, even his own family echoed these sentiments. Germany was reclaiming its destiny, they said, and America was a corrupt obstacle, too weak and divided to truly challenge the might of the Wehrmacht. The call to arms came swiftly. Barely out of his teens, Wilhelm found himself clad in the field gray uniform of the German army, thrust into the maelstrom of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The frozen steppes became his reality. The propaganda images of easy victory dissolved into a nightmare of mud, snow, and relentless savage fighting. He witnessed horrors that seared themselves into his memory. Comrades freezing to death in shallow foxholes, the constant thunder of artillery, the gnawing hunger that reduced proud soldiers to scavenging for scraps. Survival became the only ideology that mattered. Hardness was demanded, compassion was a liability. He learned to suppress fear, to obey orders without question, and to view the enemy, any enemy, as less than human, an obstacle to be overcome or eliminated. The initial confidence instilled by years of propaganda eroded under the sheer scale of Russian resistance and the brutal winters. Yet the fear of capture remained absolute. Officers constantly reminded them of alleged Soviet atrocities, and whispered rumors painted the Western allies, particularly the Americans, as equally barbaric, albeit in different ways. They would exploit prisoners, starve them, or worse, hand them over to the vengeful Russians. Surrender was unthinkable. Death in battle was preferable. Wilhelm's war on the Eastern Front ended abruptly, not with a heroic last stand, but with the chaotic collapse of his unit during a Soviet counteroffensive in late 1943. Wounded and disoriented, he was captured, but not by the Russians. In the bewildering fluidity of the front, he found himself swept up by advancing American forces who had pushed deep into occupied territory from the west. The moment of capture was terrifying. Surrounded by GIs, their faces hardened by combat, their M1 rifles leveled, Wilhelm braced for the worst. He expected shouts, blows, perhaps immediate execution. Instead, a medic knelt beside him, examined his shrapnel wound with surprising gentleness, and applied a clean bandage. Another soldier offered him a canteen of water. This small act of basic human decency was the first jarring note of dissonance in the symphony of hatred he had been taught. The journey westward, away from the front, was a blur of field hospitals and transit camps. He saw thousands of fellow prisoners, their faces reflecting the same numb shock. Then came the transport ships. Packed onto a Liberty ship, he crossed the Atlantic. The sheer scale of the American war machine began to dawn on him. The endless convoys, the efficiency of the ports, the casual abundance of supplies. It subtly chipped away at the narrative of a weak America. The arrival in America itself was a profound shock. Stepping off the train in a place called Algona, Iowa, in the spring of 1944, Wilhelm expected a desolate prison. Instead, he saw a landscape of impossible green, tidy farms stretching to the horizon, and skies utterly empty of bombers or flak. The POW camp, Camp Algona, was orderly, clean, and surprisingly well equipped. He was issued a uniform, not rags. He slept on a cot with blankets, not straw. And the food was beyond belief. White bread, actual meat, potatoes, coffee with milk and sugar, served on trays in a large, noisy mess hole. He ate cautiously at first, suspicion warring with gnawing hunger. Could this be real, or was it merely a prelude to some unimaginable cruelty? He saw American guards laughing amongst themselves, seemingly unconcerned by the thousands of enemy soldiers they were guarding. He saw tractors working in nearby fields, symbols of an agricultural abundance Germany could only dream of. The systematic, almost casual humanity of the camp was more psychologically disorienting than brutality would have been. It forced a question into his mind. If this is how America treats its enemies, how did we get everything so wrong? It was in this state of confusion, grappling with the crumbling pillars of his worldview, that Wilhelm learned he would be part of a work detail sent out daily to assist on local farms struggling with wartime labor shortages. He was about to leave the relative anonymity of the camp and step into the intimate world of an American family, the Miller farm. The American heartland in 1944 was a landscape transformed by war, yet paradoxically untouched by its physical destruction. While millions of men were overseas, the farms remained the nation's vital breadbasket, tasked with feeding not only America, but much of the Allied world. This created an unprecedented labor crisis. Fields needed tending, harvests needed gathering, and there simply weren't enough hands. It was into this gap that the German POW stepped up. The decision to use POW labor was controversial, born of necessity. Many Americans, fueled by patriotism and grief over sons lost in battle, initially resisted the idea of working alongside the enemy. Concerns about security, sabotage, and simple propriety were widespread. Yet the pragmatism of war won out. Under strict rules set by the Geneva Convention and overseen by the U.S. Army, programs were established allowing prisoners to volunteer for work details, primarily in agriculture and non-defense-related industries. They would be paid a nominal wage, usually 80 cents a day, paid in camp scrip, contributing to the war effort indirectly by freeing up American workers. Camp Algona became a major hub for this program in Iowa, sending out hundreds of prisoners each day to farms across Kossuth County and beyond. The Miller farm was typical of the region: several hundred acres of corn and soybeans, a herd of dairy cows, and a collection of sturdy barns and outhouses. John Miller, the patriarch, was a man in his late 50s, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. His two oldest sons were serving in the Pacific, leaving him, his wife Martha, and their younger daughter, Sarah, struggling to keep the farm running. Like many of his neighbors, John was initially hesitant about using German labor. He'd read the papers, heard the horror stories. But desperation outweighed his reservations. The army truck arrived early one morning, depositing Wilhelm and 3 other young Germans, accompanied by a single American guard, Private Miller, no relation, who seemed barely older than the prisoners themselves. The first interactions were stiff and cautious. John Miller, through gestures and a few basic German words learned from his immigrant grandparents, assigned tasks: mending fences, clearing fields, helping in the dairy barn. Wilhelm, who had grown up in a farming village, quickly demonstrated his competence. He knew how to handle tools, how to work with animals, how to pace himself through a long day's labor. There was a silent language of work that transcended nationality. Martha Miller watched from the farmhouse window, her heart heavy with conflict. Her own son, Tom, was somewhere in Italy, fighting men just like these. How could she possibly feel anything but resentment? Yet, as the days passed, she saw them working diligently, respectfully. She saw their youth, their weariness. They looked less like the demonic figures of propaganda and more like
boys. Boys caught on the wrong side of a terrible war. Private Miller, the guard, often sat under a tree, reading a book, his rifle propped beside him. His presence was a reminder of their status, but his relaxed posture suggested a low level of perceived threat. He would chat occasionally with John, but mostly left the farmer to direct the work. This atmosphere of relative normalcy began to subtly erode the prisoners' defenses. They were treated not as monsters, but as hired hands, albeit captive ones. The physical labor was demanding, but it felt purposeful, a stark contrast to the enforced idleness of the camp. And then came the small gestures that began to build an unexpected bridge. On hot afternoons, Martha started bringing out cool water, then lemonade. Sometimes, young Sarah, overcoming her shyness, would offer them cookies she had helped bake. These simple offerings, given without fanfare, spoke volumes.
The real shift occurred one blustery Sunday in late autumn. The harvest was mostly in, but there were still endless chores, repairing equipment, preparing the barns for winter. Wilhelm and the others had worked alongside John Miller all morning, the cold wind biting at their faces. As noon approached, the familiar rumble of the army trucks signaled the end of their workday and the return to the camp's routine meals. But as Wilhelm wiped grease from his hands, John Miller walked over, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Martha, she cooked up a big roast," he began, speaking slowly, using simple words. He pointed towards the farmhouse, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. "Plenty. You boys eat with us today?" Wilhelm froze. He understood the words, but the meaning seemed impossible. Enter an American home? Sit at their table? Share their family meal? Camp regulations strictly forbade fraternization, especially entering civilian residences. It felt like a test, or perhaps a misunderstanding. He glanced at the guard, Private Miller, expecting a firm refusal. The young private looked conflicted, chewing his lip. He knew the rules, but he also knew the Millers, respected them, and he saw the sincerity in John's eyes. After a long pause, the guard gave a barely perceptible nod, turning his gaze towards the horizon as if suddenly fascinated by a distant cloud formation. He wasn't officially sanctioning it, but he wasn't stopping it either. Walking towards that farmhouse felt like crossing into forbidden territory. The other prisoners hung back, unsure, but John gestured again, more firmly this time. Wilhelm took a deep breath and followed. The warmth inside the kitchen enveloped him instantly, a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. The air was thick with the rich aroma of roasting meat, baked bread, and something sweet, cinnamon perhaps. Martha Miller stood by the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. She offered a small, nervous smile, her eyes holding a mixture of apprehension and welcome. Sarah peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, her eyes wide with curiosity. The table was laden with food, a large roast beef, bowls overflowing with mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, freshly baked rolls, a pitcher of milk. It wasn't just a meal, it was a feast, an emblem of the impossible abundance Wilhelm had witnessed since arriving in America. He felt a surge of shame, thinking of his own family, likely huddled in a bombed-out cellar, surviving on watery soup. How could he possibly sit here and partake in this bounty? He took a seat where John indicated, acutely aware of his worn uniform, the dirt still ingrained in his hands despite a hasty wash at the pump outside. The other Millers took their places, John's elderly father quiet in the corner, Sarah squirming slightly in her chair. Then John bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice steady, "we thank you for this food, for this home. We pray for our sons overseas, keep them safe, and we pray for these young men here, far from their homes too. Amen." Wilhelm kept his head bowed long after the amen, overwhelmed. Praying for him? An enemy? At their family table? It shattered the last vestiges of the propaganda image of the hateful, godless American. As the food was passed, the initial silence gave way to tentative conversation. John asked Wilhelm about farming in Bavaria. Martha asked if he missed his mother. Sarah asked if he had ever seen snow as deep as Iowa's. Wilhelm answered haltingly in his broken English, surprised at how much he could communicate, how much they seemed genuinely interested. He ate slowly, savoring flavors he hadn't tasted in years, acutely aware of every bite. It wasn't just food nourishing his body. It was the atmosphere of simple, unpretentious humanity healing something deeper within him. That first Sunday dinner wasn't an isolated event. Other POWs across America were experiencing similar, quiet acts of defiance against the hatred of war. In Nebraska, farmers shared Thanksgiving meals. In Texas, families brought Christmas cookies to the camp fences. These moments, often unrecorded, were part of a hidden narrative of the home front, a testament to the fact that even in total war, individual compassion could find a way to bloom. That first Sunday dinner was not an anomaly. It became the new normal. Week after week, provided the weather and farm work allowed, Wilhelm found himself sharing the miller's midday meal. The initial tension eased, replaced by a routine that felt both extraordinary and strangely comforting. He learned the rhythms of their household, the inside jokes, the quiet ways they supported each other through the anxieties of wartime. He learned the names of John's sons fighting overseas, Tom in Italy, Peter in the Pacific, and saw the worry etched on Martha's face whenever the radio news mentioned battles in those theaters. He learned about Sarah's school, about the elderly grandfather's memories of immigrating from Germany decades ago, a connection that sometimes allowed for easier conversation in broken German when English failed. This shared language, however fragmented, became a small bridge. The grandfather, initially suspicious, began asking Wilhelm about his home region, discovering a shared cultural heritage buried beneath the uniforms of war. He spoke of Bavarian folk songs Wilhelm remembered from childhood festivals, a poignant reminder of a life before the Reich. The Millers, in turn, saw beyond the enemy uniform. They saw Wilhelm's skill with machinery, his quiet diligence, his surprising gentleness with their animals. They saw the sadness that sometimes clouded his eyes when he spoke of his family, whose fate remained unknown amidst the Allied bombing campaigns devastating German cities. John Miller, a pragmatic man, appreciated Wilhelm's contribution to the farm's survival. Without the POW labor, he admitted one evening, they might have lost the harvest. This mutual dependence fostered a grudging respect that slowly warmed into genuine affection. Martha, despite her constant worry for her own sons, found herself adopting a maternal concern for Wilhelm. She mended tears in his work uniform, ensured he had extra blankets when the Iowa winter descended with brutal force, and always saved him a second helping of her apple cake, which he ate with a quiet reverence that spoke volumes about the deprivations he had endured. She saw the letters he received occasionally via the Red Cross, saw the anguish on his face when news from home was bad or absent altogether. It became harder and harder to see him simply as the enemy. The children, Sarah and her younger brother Michael, were perhaps the most effective ambassadors of peace. Unburdened by political hatred, they saw Wilhelm simply as a fixture on the farm, a strong pair of hands, and a source of curiosity. Sarah would practice her rudimentary German phrases on him, giggling at his corrections. Michael, fascinated by Wilhelm's past life, would ask endless questions about German forests and castles fueled by fairy tales. Wilhelm, in turn, found solace in their innocent company. He carved small wooden animals for them during breaks, simple figures whittled with a borrowed pocket knife, a squirrel, a bird, a horse. These small gifts became treasured possessions for the children, tangible symbols of an unlikely friendship. One afternoon, Michael brought out his collection of American toy soldiers, brightly painted GIs and miniature tanks. He began arranging them for a mock battle. Wilhelm watched silently, a knot tightening in his stomach. But then, Michael handed him a few figures. "You be the Germans," the boy said simply, without malice, just stating a fact. Wilhelm hesitated, then knelt beside the boy, moving the toy soldiers as Michael directed. The grim reality of war momentarily transformed a child's innocent game. It was a surreal moment, highlighting the chasm between the world outside and the fragile peace found within the Miller farm's boundaries. Wilhelm's journal entries from this period, later discovered and archived, reveal the profound internal conflict these interactions provoked. "Frau Miller treats me as she would her own son," he wrote one evening. "She worries I am not eating enough, though I eat more here than I ever did in the army. John speaks to me of crop rotation as if I were a neighbor, not a prisoner. How can this be? We were told they were barbarians." He wrestled with the cognitive dissonance. Everything he was experiencing contradicted the foundations of his upbringing. He saw American democracy not as the chaotic mess described by Goebbels, but as a system that fostered community, resilience, and a deep sense of fairness, even towards enemies. He witnessed firsthand the incredible productivity of American agriculture, the sheer scale of the fields, the power of the machinery, the seemingly endless bounty harvested each fall. John Miller spoke casually of crop yields per acre that were double what Wilhelm's family farm in Bavaria could ever achieve, even in peacetime. This wasn't just military might, it was a fundamental power rooted in the land and the way people lived. He wasn't alone in this transformation. Across the United States, similar stories were unfolding, often unrecorded. Historian Arnold Kramer documented numerous instances of friendships developing between German POWs and American families, particularly in rural areas where the shared rhythm of agricultural life created common ground. In Texas, prisoners working cotton fields were sometimes invited to community barbecues, under guard but present nonetheless. In Wisconsin, dairy farmers discovered that many prisoners possessed invaluable skills in cheese-making or animal husbandry. Letters from other POWs shared cautiously within Camp Algona spoke of similar experiences: invitations to church picnics, gifts of clothing, even help writing letters in English. These weren't universal occurrences. Suspicion and hostility certainly existed in many communities. But the frequency of these acts of kindness, especially in the agricultural heartland, was remarkable. It suggested a deep current of American pragmatism and moral confidence, a belief that treating defeated enemies humanely was not a sign of weakness but of strength. The cultural exchange extended beyond meals and conversation. Wilhelm learned about American holidays, experiencing his first real Thanksgiving at the Miller's table, bewildered by the sheer variety and quantity of food dedicated to a single meal. He saw the family gather around the radio to listen to President Roosevelt's fireside chats, struck by the direct, informal way the nation's leader spoke to his people, a stark contrast to the distant, deified image of Hitler. He learned about baseball from the Miller children, baffled by the complex rules but fascinated by the passion it inspired. He saw mail-order catalogs filled with goods, washing machines, refrigerators, new clothes, available even in wartime, a testament to a consumer economy that seemed utterly alien to the austerity of the Reich. Each small detail, the way Americans casually drank Coca-Cola, the ubiquity of automobiles, the brightly lit towns at night, reinforced the message of overwhelming abundance and a different way of life. This constant, lived exposure to American reality was far more powerful than any formal re-education program could ever be. It wasn't propaganda being lectured, it was a different world being witnessed. As the months turned into a year, Wilhelm became an integral, albeit temporary, part of the Miller Farms ecosystem. The initial awkwardness had long since faded, replaced by the easy rhythm of shared labor. He anticipated John Miller's needs almost before they were spoken, knew the quirks of the old tractor, and could calm the nervous heifer in the milking barn with a soft word in German. He watched Sarah grow taller, saw Michael lose his first tooth. He was present for birthdays, celebrated simply due to wartime rationing, yet marked by Martha's determination to bake a cake, even if it meant saving sugar rations for weeks. He witnessed the family's anxieties firsthand. The long silences after news reports from the Pacific, the tearful reading of letters from Tom and Peter that spoke of mud, fear, and homesickness. Sharing these moments of vulnerability created a bond stronger than any military regulation could forbid. He was no longer just the German prisoner. He was Wilhelm, the young man who helped keep their farm alive while their sons were away fighting his countrymen. The irony was never lost on him, a constant dull ache beneath the surface of daily life. One particularly poignant exchange occurred during the bitter Iowa winter of 1944-45. News from Europe was grim. The Battle of the Bulge raged, a desperate German counteroffensive that briefly instilled fear across the Allied lines. John Miller listened intently to the radio each evening, his face drawn. Wilhelm knew his former comrades were fighting and dying in that frozen hell, perhaps even men from his own village. He felt torn. a residual loyalty to the soldiers he had served with, yet profoundly grateful for the safety and kindness he experienced daily. One evening, after a particularly bleak news report, John Miller turned to Wilhelm, his voice heavy. "It's a terrible thing, this war," he said, not as a victor speaking to the vanquished, but as one man acknowledging shared suffering. So many young men, on both sides. Wilhelm could only nod, unable to articulate the complex swirl of grief and relief inside him. But in that shared moment of quiet sorrow, the barrier between us and them seemed to dissolve entirely. They were simply two men caught in the currents of history, finding common ground in their shared humanity. Wilhelm's skills also became a source of connection. He had a natural aptitude for mechanics, a common trait in many rural German youths. When the farm's aging corn picker broke down mid-harvest, threatening a significant loss, John Miller wrestled with it for hours, unable to fix the complex gearing. Wilhelm watched quietly, then hesitantly stepped forward. Using gestures and sketching diagrams in the dirt, he explained what he thought was wrong. Skeptical but desperate, John allowed him to try. Wilhelm spent the next day meticulously disassembling, cleaning, and repairing the damaged parts, using only the basic tools available in the farm's workshop. By evening, the machine roared back to life, running more smoothly than it had in years. John Miller stared, first at the machine, then at Wilhelm, and simply clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of respect that transcended words. From that day on, John often sought Wilhelm's opinion on mechanical problems, treating him less like a prisoner and more like a trusted assistant. This validation of his skills, his inherent worth beyond his uniform, was profoundly affirming for Wilhelm. Martha, too, found ways to bridge the gap. She noticed Wilhelm often staring wistfully at photographs of her sons. One afternoon, she gently took down a picture of Tom, her eldest, from the mantelpiece. "He likes to ski," she said, pointing to the snowy background in the photo. "Like in your Bavaria." Wilhelm nodded, his throat tight. He showed her a worn photo he kept hidden, a picture of himself as a teenager on skis in the Alps. For a few minutes, they weren't American mother and German prisoner, but two people sharing memories of suns and mountains. Martha began leaving German-language newspapers in the barn, obtained through connections at her church. Carefully censored, no doubt, but still a link to his own language and culture. She even tried learning a few German words, her attempts often mangling the pronunciation, but delivered with such earnest goodwill that Wilhelm couldn't help but smile. These small, consistent acts of thoughtfulness chipped away at the last remnants of his ideological conditioning. How could he reconcile the image of the heartless American enemy with this woman who mended his socks and tried to speak his language? The emotional peak of Wilhelm's time on the Miller farm arrived unexpectedly, not during a holiday or a grand gesture, but on an ordinary weekday afternoon in the spring of 1945. News of Germany's imminent collapse filled the airwaves. Wilhelm worked with a heavy heart, his thoughts consumed by the fate of his homeland and the family he hadn't heard from in months. He was helping John Miller repair a section of fence along the far pasture when Martha appeared, walking quickly from the house, her face pale. She held a small, official-looking envelope. It was a telegram. John took it, his hands trembling slightly as he tore it open. He read it, then read it again, his face draining of color. Martha watched him, her hand pressed to her mouth. John looked up, his eyes meeting Wilhelm's across the fence line. It's Peter," John choked out. "His ship, torpedoed, in the Pacific. He's missing." The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Wilhelm felt his own breath catch. Peter, the younger son, the one whose photograph showed him grinning proudly in his Navy uniform. He had seen that photo countless times on the Miller's mantelpiece. In that moment, something broke inside Wilhelm. The carefully constructed barriers between prisoner and captor, between German and American, vanished completely. He saw not John Miller, the farmer who employed him, but a father grieving for his son. He saw Martha, not the enemy's wife, but a mother whose heart was breaking, just as his own mother's heart must have broken countless times. Without thinking, without considering the rules or the risks, Wilhelm vaulted over the fence. He walked quickly to John, who stood stunned, the telegram fluttering in his hand. Wilhelm didn't know what to say, his English inadequate for such profound grief. So he did the only thing that felt human. He reached out and placed his hand on John Miller's shoulder. He stood there silently beside the farmer, sharing the weight of the terrible news. After a long moment, John looked at Wilhelm, his eyes filled with tears, and nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of shared sorrow that transcended nationality, politics, and war. Martha stepped forward then, not recoiling from the German soldier, but leaning slightly against him, seeking comfort from the enemy her son had died fighting. They stood there for several minutes under the vast Iowa sky, an American farmer, his wife, and a German prisoner of war, united not by victory or defeat, but by the universal language of loss. It was the ultimate paradox, the most profound demonstration of the bond that had formed, a bond sealed not in ink or law, but in shared work, shared meals, and now shared grief. The news about Peter cast a shadow over the farm, but it did not break the connection between Wilhelm and the Millers. If anything, the shared grief deepened their unspoken understanding. Wilhelm worked with even greater diligence, pouring his own sorrow and empathy into the physical labor, wanting, in some small way, to ease the burden on the grieving family. Later, news would arrive that Peter had been rescued, a survivor, bringing immense relief, but the impact of that moment of shared fear and loss remained. When VE Day arrived in May 1945, the atmosphere was muted. There was relief, yes, but the Millers' joy was tempered by worry for Tom, still serving in occupied Italy, and the memory of Peter's close call. For Wilhelm, it was a day of profound complexity, relief that the killing had stopped, deep shame for his nation's defeat and atrocities, and an uncertain future. His time at the Miller farm was drawing to an end. As the army began the complex process of repatriation, Wilhelm knew he would soon leave this place that had become, against all odds, a refuge. The day he left, the entire Miller family came to see him off at the camp truck. There were awkward handshakes, tears in Martha and Sarah's eyes. John Miller pressed a small, worn Bible into Wilhelm's hand. "You write," he said gruffly. "Let us know you got home safe." Wilhelm could only nod, his throat too tight. He climbed into the truck, looking back at the family standing by the house gate until they were just small figures in the distance. He carried with him not just memories, but a transformed understanding of the world, and a debt of gratitude he felt he could never repay. Repatriation was jarring. He returned to a Bavaria scarred by war, his village damaged, many neighbors lost. He learned his parents had survived, but the farm was struggling. Rebuilding his life was a slow, arduous process. Yet, amidst the ruins, the memory of Iowa, of the Millers, remained a beacon. As soon as international mail allowed, he wrote that first letter, addressed simply, hoping it would find its way. When the reply came, months later, bearing John Miller's familiar, steady handwriting, Wilhelm wept. Thus began the 50-year correspondence. The letters tracked the rhythms of their lives: births, deaths, marriages, harvests, grandchildren. Wilhelm rebuilt his family farm, incorporating some of the efficient techniques he'd observed in Iowa. He became a respected member of his community, quietly advocating for reconciliation. He always spoke of the Millers not as captors, but the family who showed him the meaning of humanity when he expected none. He addressed John Miller as father, a title John accepted with quiet pride. The Millers, in turn, kept Wilhelm's letters, sharing them with their children and grandchildren, using his story as a lesson in compassion. Tom and Peter returned safely from the war, and over the years,
The news about Peter cast a shadow over the farm, but it did not break the connection between Wilhelm and the Millers. If anything, the shared grief deepened their unspoken understanding. Wilhelm worked with even greater diligence, pouring his own sorrow and empathy into the physical labor, wanting, in some small way, to ease the burden on the grieving family. Later, news would arrive that Peter had been rescued, a survivor, bringing immense relief. But the impact of that moment of shared fear and loss remained. When VE Day arrived in May 1945, the atmosphere was muted. There was relief, yes, but the Millers' joy was tempered by worry for Tom, still serving in occupied Italy, and the memory of Peter's close call. For Wilhelm, it was a day of profound complexity.
Relief that the killing had stopped, deep shame for his nation's defeat and atrocities, and an uncertain future. His time at the Miller farm was drawing to a close. As the army began the complex process of repatriation, Wilhelm knew he would soon leave this place that had become, against all odds, a refuge. The day he left, the entire Miller family came to see him off at the camp truck. There were awkward handshakes, tears in Martha's and Sarah's eyes. John Miller pressed a small worn Bible into Wilhelm's hand. "You write," he said gruffly. "Let us know you got home safe." Wilhelm could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He climbed into the truck, looking back at the family standing by the farmhouse gate until they were just small figures in the distance. He carried with him not just memories, but a transformed understanding of the world, and a debt of gratitude he felt he could never repay. Repatriation was jarring. He returned to a Bavaria scarred by war, his village damaged, many neighbors lost. He learned his parents had survived, but the farm was struggling. Rebuilding his life was a slow, arduous process. Yet, amidst the ruins, the memory of Iowa, of the Millers, remained a beacon. As soon as international mail allowed, he wrote that first letter, addressed simply, hoping it would find its way. When the reply came, months later, bearing John Miller's familiar, steady handwriting, Wilhelm wept. Thus began the 50-year correspondence. The letters tracked the rhythms of their lives: births, deaths, marriages, harvests, grandchildren. Wilhelm rebuilt his family farm, incorporating some of the efficient techniques he'd observed in Iowa. He became a respected member of his community, quietly advocating for reconciliation and understanding. He always spoke of the Millers not as captors, but as the family who showed him the meaning of humanity when he expected none. He addressed John Miller as "Father" in his letters, a title John accepted with quiet pride. The Millers, in turn, kept Wilhelm's letters, sharing them with their children and grandchildren, using his story as a lesson in compassion. Tom and Peter returned safely from the war, and over the years, they too came to accept Wilhelm as a distant, unlikely member of their extended family. In the 1970s, Wilhelm, now a grandfather himself, finally returned to Iowa. He stood once more on the porch of the Miller farmhouse, embracing John, now elderly and frail. They spoke for hours, not as former prisoner and captor, but as old friends, bound by a shared history that defied easy explanation. Wilhelm Fischer passed away in the late 1990s. Among his cherished possessions was a box filled with 50 years of letters from Iowa, and a small, faded photograph of a smiling American family standing beside a young German soldier in a worn uniform. The story of Wilhelm and the Millers is more than just a historical anecdote. It stands as powerful evidence of the human capacity for connection even amidst global conflict. It highlights an often overlooked aspect of the American W2 experience, the quiet, personal diplomacy conducted not by politicians, by ordinary families on the home front. Their simple acts of kindness, inviting an enemy to share their table, became a profound testament to the values they believed they were fighting for. Wilhelm never forgot the farmer he called father, a man who represented the enemy nation but who ultimately showed him the path back to his own humanity. Their half-century bond remains a quiet but powerful legacy, proving that sometimes the deepest connections are forged not in spite of our differences, but because we dare to look past them.